First, a few words about Speak Out and our perspective on the current moment. It's easy to look out at the world and feel overwhelmed. Essential programs like SNAP and Medicaid are being cut, Obamacare premiums are being jacked up, and all the while, the wealthiest people on the planet continue to grow even richer. Today, just three Americans, Elon Musk, Larry Ellison, and Mark Zuckerberg, hold more wealth than the 150 million lowest earning Americans combined. All this is happening as the Trump administration is providing over a massive transfer of wealth to the richest in our society through tax cuts, massive military contracts, and direct subsidization of their companies with public funds. These politicians then lie to us and say that we must blame immigrants and minorities for taking resources that should be going to so-called real Americans. The truth is that the system has no interest in providing a better future for working people. The only goal in the minds of the ultra-rich who make the decisions that we have to live with is to take more and more for themselves, leaving us to fight for the scraps. For these reasons, we believe change can never come from within this system. In order to stop the constant abuses done in the name of profit, we must end capitalism and replace it with something truly democratic, where the needs of the many come before the whims of a few. That system, where those who do the work that makes society run collectively make decisions for themselves, is socialism. Only when the people who must deal with the consequences are the ones making the decisions can we meaningfully confront the multitude of crises that face us. This is the change we in Speak Out work towards. This change is only possible through the global united activity of the majority of people, the people who do the work that makes society run. In our work, we participate in the struggles of our time to oppose the attacks that are inevitable under capitalism, while putting forward the perspective that we must also keep focus on the entire system in our organizing. One of the things we do as a group is to put on these monthly town hall discussion events where we invite presenters with expertise on current issues to share their knowledge. These presenters may or may not share all of our political perspectives, but they are people with whom we can agree on the need for systemic change and the importance of discussing these questions. We need to build a different society, and that will require an organization of and for the working class, taking a leading role in the struggles ahead. But this organization does not yet exist. It is up to us and activists around the world to build it. I will now introduce and turn things over to our wonderful speaker. Dr. Clara Mattei is a professor of economics at the University of Tulsa and the president of FREE, the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. Her most recent book is The Capital Order: How Economists Invented Austerity and Paved the Way to Fascism. Dr. Mattei, thanks so much for joining us. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? It's good? Can I have a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay, cool, awesome, fantastic. I'm in a very interesting place. I'm at St. Jerome Church. Actually, I'm speaking to you from where usually we see the priest. I'm here because we are just actually ending our assembly with the FREE, and I want to speak about the FREE as an experiment in praxis, which is what I think is truly needed. You hear me okay, right? Okay, and I also have my son who's sleeping on top of me. So if he wakes up, I'm gonna have to deliver him somewhere. Sorry, this is the condition. Okay, so thank you so much for the great presentation. I think the type of research I've been bringing forward fits into showing how historical inquiry can facilitate an empowering perspective about the present moment. And there's nothing more obvious if one focuses on a magic word, which is the word austerity, a word that is rarely spoken because it had a negative connotation after the 2008 sovereign debt crisis and the massive dosage of social sacrifice that was inflicted on American and as well as European and global citizens. So the fact is that austerity is a word that is rarely mentioned. And when it is mentioned, it's mentioned in a way that makes us lose sight of what really matters. Now, what really matters is to understand that austerity has nothing to do with living within our means and acting virtuously to balance the budget, which is the story we hear, right? The fact that the debt is too high, we really need to get a hold of ourselves and act rationally. This is the technocratic message that completely loses sight of what is actually happening. If you read the definition of austerity on a dictionary online, if you open now and Google it, what you will hear is that austerity is about cuts in the budget and increases in taxes. Now, this definition is completely empty because it looks at the aggregate, and economists love to look at aggregate measures because they're the measures that hide, of course, what matters, which is the class conflict and who wins and who loses. So what actually austerity is about, if you look at it historically through this longer term perspective, which is the one that I tried to analyze in my book, The Capital Order, is that austerity is actually about shifting resources away from working people in favor of protecting, of course, the saver investors. Now, why is this not irrational either? And this is important because the Keynesian economists, who are usually considered the economists who are critical about austerity, just tell you that austerity is bad policy. You know, it's irrational. It's probably about like stupidity or corruption of governments. And this is also a very bad narrative because it doesn't explain why austerity has been so structural in the capitalist society and why it has been around constantly. And I would claim it's actually in the DNA of capitalism itself. Very important. Austerity is not, and we will define it in a second. Sorry, I took a route, but just to say, austerity is not equatable to neoliberalism, right? This is a very big problem of a lot of the progressive left. They think the bad guys are the neoliberalism, and if we only were outside of neoliberalism, everything would be great. This is an illusion because guess what? The big exponents of austerity were those Keynesian economists working under Johnson and Kennedy, even in the so-called golden age of capitalism, okay? So austerity has nothing to do just with neoliberalism. I claim and I show, and I think evidence speaks for itself, that austerity is in the DNA of capitalism, and it is actually comes about and it is refined in a historical moment in which capitalism was about to collapse. How? Because of an existential crisis. After the First World War, people did not believe that the two pillars of capitalism that we can define as wage labor, right? The fact that to exist, the majority on this planet and the majority of Americans have to go sell their capacity to work for a wage, usually a very low one, because that's how they survive, given that they depend on the market. Anything they want to buy, from food to shelter to school to healthcare, of course, they need to buy with money in their pockets. And of course, the majority has no other way to do that but to go work for a job. Okay, this is the pillar of wage labor, which we take for granted and never problematize. But it is this pillar of wage labor that is actually the peculiarity of capitalism, okay? And this pillar and the other big pillar, which is private command over investment, or we could say private property of the means of production, the fact that as a society, we have delegated the most fundamental decisions about our material conditions to a very few number of, by now, asset managers, really, right? Fewer and fewer private investors that of course, invest for profit. So logic of profit over the logic of need. So this grounding of our economic system that no economist ever problematizes is something that is so detrimental to the majority that in some historical moments, people rise up and say no more to these two pillars and demand a different socioeconomic system. I will say more of that in a second, but I don't want to leave my thoughts where I left them off to say what austerity is about is not irrationality, is very rational policymaking from the part of those elites who benefit from our economic system. And in the introduction, we see how few benefit, right? We know that actually one out of the $3 of wealth that $3 out of the $3 that circulate in the United States economy are appropriated by the top 30%. Okay, so it's like really sorry, not the top 30%, what I'm saying, the top 1%, apologies, okay? So the top 1% appropriates one out of the $3 that circulates in the United States economy. So clearly the system benefits very few, but austerity is crucial to capitalism because it maintains that market dependence that is fundamental for our society to operate in order for people to not be able to speak up, organize collectively, and make structural change. Okay, so what we see to conclude is that austerity has nothing to do with balancing the budget, has nothing, and the Trump bill, of course, speaks loads. We know that the big, beautiful bill is one of the most expensive endeavors in American history and is the epitome of austerity. Why? Because it is about, again, eliminating social expenditures. And we well know the billions that are being cut on healthcare and food. But in order to fund what? The military-industrial complex, prisons, our border patrol, private investment. The state has an active role under capitalism in securing that people have to go work for a wage because you take everything away from them. And in the meantime, protecting private investment. So you see, austerity is about protecting these two pillars in a very violent and interventionist way. So I want to tell you that the story that the market is natural and spontaneous, and the fact that if the state steps back, the market would flourish on its own, is complete ideology. There is no free market. There is no natural market. What we need is constant state intervention in wielding austerity to maintain the social relation of production that are necessary for capitalism to function in place. And what you need to function, in fact, the title of my book is The Capital Order, exactly to point to the most important intuition in Marxian analysis. And I think if there's one intuition that we need to keep to ourselves is this one. Why was Marx a revolutionary thinker? Not because he refined the labor theory of value. That's something that others before him had been doing. What is important about Marx is that he problematizes, he denaturalizes what even Ricardo and Smith were taking for granted, which is that capital, as wealth, as GDP growth, as money, is based upon capital as a social relation of production. Again, meaning that capital is based on political equilibrium that is quite fragile because it historically presupposes the subordination and the alienation of the majority. So you understand that if capital is actually a social relation and it entails the majority being subordinated because they have no control over investment, no say off of their own even daily life and work life, well, then this capital needs to be protected. And what austerity does is protect capital. So I want to just say, just tell you briefly, and then you can, if you like, read the book. And if you want the book and you can't buy it, I'm very happy to send you a PDF. So just email me, please. What happens is that if you look at the origins of austerity, the whole story becomes quite clear. And you see that what happening today is nothing but an acceleration, and a very violent acceleration of what, of course, is the norm, okay, under capitalism. So when did austerity emerge? It emerges again after the First World War, very clearly, to block and kill all of these post-capitalist experiments that were actually being experimented with very concretely, not just in revolutionary Russia and Eastern Europe, but in the heartland of Western capitalism. So what I show is that in places like the UK, Italy, but also the US, which I have not focused on in my book, but also in the US, there are all these experiments to go beyond wage labor in name of self-governance of labor, to go beyond private investment in the name of collective investment for need rather than profit. And you can see the details, if you like, in the book about factory councils, Antonio Gramsci, the whole movement of the workers' councils that was spreading. And Italy is a very interesting case. I'm also Italian, so I have a bias towards that. So that's why you also find it in the book. But anyway, all of these experiments were efficiently got rid of through austerity policies. So let me just conclude by defining what austerity is and telling you that after the First World War, what happens is that economists start advising governments. Again, the fact that economists advise governments is not a given. It could be city councils or like people advising governments. No, it's technocrats. And the reason for this is that these economists come up with really, really good reasons for which people should be excluded from economic decision making. So these economists, with their new neoclassical framework, the mainstream economics that people study today in school, is based on assumptions that are terribly classist. And what I show in my book is that these economists, while they were claiming that they were pure, they were calling themselves pure economists, right? So pure economics takes the place of what was traditionally political economy. And pure economics claims to be pure while really operating at the most deeply political level in convincing everybody that workers count nothing. They do not create value. Value does not come from unpaid labor, that like Marx would tell us. Value comes from the very rational savers investors who are the select few in society that the state needs to protect. So what you see is that these economists that rise to power were in Italy allowing Benito Mussolini, the founding father of fascism, right? We talk about fascism today. Well, I study fascism in its original form in Italy, right, under the regime of Benito Mussolini. And what you find out is that these fascists needed these economists, these pure economists, these objective, supposedly scientific men to justify this plundering of resources through austerity from the people. Okay. And so what is interesting is that you go from a moment in which the labor theory of value told you that value came from labor and unpaid labor to this idea that actually it's the entrepreneur who counts, that there's no classes, that there's only individuals, that there's no conflict, that there's only harmony. All of this is the new framework, or we can call it paradigm or model, whatever you like, the new lens, if you like, that is still the hardcore of economics today. Okay. And it emerges exactly in a moment in which workers were demanding systemic change. And these economists were so successful in justifying austerity that they were able to implement it throughout Europe, United States, the global South, and were able to eliminate alternatives to capitalism. So let me just conclude by saying that austerity is not, again, about cutting budgets and increasing taxes. It's about cutting social expenditures to fund the genocides in Sudan and in Palestine that we're seeing today, military-industrial complex, again, private shareholders that are toasting while the Palestinian kids get murdered. I just want to stress that Lockheed Martin had an obscene increase in the value of their stocks, if you look historically from October 2023 to today. Leonardo is one of the worst, Italian again, that they went up 274% from October 23 to July 2025. Okay. And we know that through the United Arab Emirates, the shareholders of the West celebrating as over 15 million people are being displaced as we speak in Sudan and murdered brutally. Well, this is again because austerity channels all of the value that is being produced towards these savior investors. Austerity is also not about raising taxes, it's about regressive taxation. What is that? The fact that in the United States, like everywhere else in the globe, labor pays far more taxes than capital, right? We know that those who live off of interest, dividends, and rent are basically de-taxed with respect to how much people are getting taxed in their own wages, when that money that they don't even see because they're already taken out of their paychecks before they can even see it. So with very little space for evasion at the bottom, a lot of legal space for evasion at the top. Okay. So regressive taxation is key. Again, is this stupid? No, it's stupid for us, of course, the logic of need, but it's rational for the logic of profit. And this is the whole point. What is rational for the logic of need is irrational for the logic of profit. And what is irrational for the logic of profit is irrational for the logic of need. So austerity is very rational for the logic of profit and very irrational for the logic of need. What does this mean? It means that it's good if you tax workers more because you make them more market dependent and thus more willing to go work for a wage and less willing to organize. And at the same time, capable of, and at the same time, you protect the demand for the demand and for the realization of profit of the shareholders, the private investors. So that's fiscal austerity for you, regressive taxation and cuts in social expenditures. Then we have monetary austerity, of course, that serves the same exact purpose. You increase interest rates, and we know that that's how basically the struggles of the last couple of years post-COVID were defeated in the United States, was because the Fed, this independent, objective central bank, actually purposefully increased interest rates to weaken the labor market, right? Because if you make money more expensive to borrow, you're slowing down the economy. So not only do people lose because their credit card bills are more expensive and their mortgage gets more expensive, and of course, those who lend money are getting richer and richer, and banks and financial institutions got obscenely rich given these increases in interest rates. At the same time, people are also losing as workers because they're losing their jobs. And if you lose your job, the reserve army of labor, of course, gets bigger and workers are more easily disciplined. And this is exactly what happened after the First World War in Britain. People are demanding a nationalization of the central bank, worker self-management. Strikes were like at the peak historically. As the Bank of England increased interest rates, a couple months after, the unemployment rates were so bad that strikes stopped, and so did unionization, and everything was gone. Okay, so monetary austerity is a very important component. And of course, then industrial austerity. What is industrial austerity? Labor deregulation, so killing unions, privatization, so the state actively selling public assets to private shareholders, and of course, any measure to compress wages. Mussolini was, and I conclude here to say that Mussolini was so good at doing austerity, thanks to all his economists backing him, that the liberals in the US, in Britain, in Italy loved Mussolini. So I have a whole chapter to show you that, you know, the establishment could not wait to have a fascist dictator in place in order to concretely and efficiently apply austerity measures that allowed for private investors from foreign countries to fly back to Italy and start speculating again in a country that until that moment had been, you know, had seen occupation of factories and occupation of agriculture through assemblies. So this is a little bit of my 2 cents, is that history does help look more deeply at what's happening today, right? And this is really important because I do think that the only way in which we can take back some power is to kill the narrative that we've gotten so attuned to, that we fall victims as on the left to the same type of narratives that are actually quite disempowering to us. So one message that is important is to say there is no market without the state. The state under neoliberalism and under capitalism always plays an active role to discipline workers and to extract resources and to protect the select few. And this is by no means neutral or apolitical, right? So technocracy is a sham, of course. And I think what we need to do is use knowledge in order to empower movements on the ground. I would like to say in closing that the reason I'm in this church is because we have an assembly called the FREE, Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. You can check out our website and connect with us. We have a pretty cool YouTube channel, and also we do events that we run also online. It's freeforum.org. So I hope you guys can follow us, because we are not only offering, I think, a space for knowledge, we're also trying to do something that concretely changes, hopefully, the dynamics here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm Italian. I lived in New York for many years. I was an associate professor at the New School for Social Research, and now I'm in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the FREE operates as a grassroots assembly. We just elected the community board members, and we have assemblies once every 2 weeks It's over 60 people involved. Today at the assembly, it's around 35, 40 people sitting together now and deliberating. And we are trying to activate through these neighborhood councils. Now the city auditor actually just joined our meeting today to see if we can actually help push for more democratic Tulsa. We know that Tulsa is basically all decisions are being made by the philanthropist who donate the money to the election of the mayor. And the mayor has just decided that they're going to pass a very regressive tax budget that will tax consumption taxes, again, very regressive, right? You're taxing all the same, but really you're taxing the workers much more in order to fund police and supposedly this homelessness project that is really all for the much of it goes to the nonprofit industrial complex, right? So we're having an event on food sovereignty that is coming up, and we're activating all the different people. We have Cooperation Tulsa on the ground that tries to grow independently. So we're doing a lot of stuff. I don't want to bore you, but is to say that we're trying to combine knowledge that is actually for people, and flyering is crucial. We have flyering up and downtown like crazy, and we have events with around 200 people showing up. The next one will be here at this church, so we're kind of itinerant. But we are also trying to do more concrete planning on the ground that combines with education. And we see how it goes. I hope it becomes kind of a pilot project that can show how we can really take back our space if we mean to. And of course, the first thing to do is breach market dependence, which austerity so forcefully tries to invigorate. Thank you very much for listening to me. I can stay, 15, 20 minutes more. Then I would like to go back so that I can follow the last part of the assembly, and hope that you can also continue your conversation in person, which is also very important. If community comes first, the first thing to do is build community. What I learned is that we are so depoliticized that we have issues relating to one another. So even just relearning how to be together and take decisions collectively is a huge educational process. Thank you so much for having me. So absolutely. So clearly from its origins, austerity goes hand in hand with the idea of opening and expanding global capitalism as much as possible. So free trade is crucial. And by the way, this is another point in which Keynesian economists, again, advising Kennedy, Johnson, and the supposed golden age, were all about too, right? The idea of like expanding American capital thanks to deregulation of all sorts, and hating any forms of protectionism, especially from countries of the global south that were trying to somehow protect themselves from various forms of plunder. So that's very interesting. And so I think what's also interesting is that, of course, the best liberal attack to Trump is to like say, oh no, look, the tariffs are really what the problem is. I think what Trump is doing is using the tariff as basically a political messaging game and propaganda to try to retain its base once he has completely alienated them, once you are basically disenfranchising those disenfranchised that have voting for you in the first place, hoping that something would be done supposedly to make America great again or something for the people. So I think it's interesting to note how the conversation about tariffs has always been a way to take away the focus from class analysis, right? And this is really important because then you can start blaming, again, the tariffs if you're liberal, and you can start like betting all on the tariffs if you're supposedly trying to pretend you're doing something for the people. And, we know that a lot of unions fall into that trap, again, protecting their very narrow economic interest, favoring tariffs that also mean that a lot of workers in the south of the globe were losing. So the point is that tariffs, non-tariffs, this is a capitalist game. And it's really about what sectors of capitalist class you are in that moment trying to valorize. And that workers lose regardless. Because if it's not offshoring, It's the depression that comes, if not offshoring because of free trade agreements, it's about the depression that comes from potential tariffs. And this whole idea that, we can all become investors if we participate in the bounties that will come from the tariffs of Trump is clearly a way, again, to obfuscate what people need to see, which is Trump is, again, the problem is not Trump. Trump is just an acceleration, a violent representation of austerity policies. Because we know that, again, the massive tax cut on the rich go together with billions that we're sending not only to Israel, but also to all the other places in the globe that are fomenting genocide. And we know that militarism is escalating the climate breakdown that is really suicidal in this historical moment. And it's business as usual. I just actually interviewed, it's coming out on Wednesday, Andreas Malm, who I hope you can connect with. He's amazing. He's a real comrade and works on climate. And of course, climate and austerity, the climate catastrophe and austerity policies, and the way in which you try to hide all of this through COP meetings or through tariff talk are very, very much parallel lines. So those are my 2 cents. About what we do here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, it's very experimental at the moment. So what I hope we can do is connect with different movements that are also active in different places of the United States. And so I hope you can, again, check us out on the website and the YouTube channel so that we can potentially create alliances with work organizations on the ground elsewhere. The whole point here is to say that I think people get excited if we can create avenues for critical knowledge. And we had an event on incarceration that attracted a lot of interest with John Clegg, who's an amazing political economist. But every time at these events, we have a scholar combined with a lived experience. Sorry, the kid now is, let me see if Patty, one sec. Okay, the baby started crying. I had to get rid of him. Okay, so combining at each talk, we have a scholar who, I bet to be actually critical and capable of addressing real issues, an organizer, and someone with lived experience. And food sovereignty, again, is our next topic. But the idea is how to make people excited so they join. And this is a moment that helps activate something that then though needs to last. So what we're trying to do is also become the catalyst for organizations on the ground to get to know each other and grow in alliance. Because of course we know, and everyone knows this, that the real problem, the left is very guilty of the current state of affairs, especially because of its sectarianism and its incapacity to collaborate, right? So I think what the FREE does, the Forum for Real Economic Emancipation, is act as a connector, as an activator with people that are not political. We give flyers and a lot of people come who don't usually participate to neither academic events nor political events. So you bring in people that are upset, really pissed off, but they don't know how to channel that. And then you inspire, and then you activate by trying to connect what is already on the ground. And if nothing is on the ground on that particular issue, you try to build it. This is what the Assembly tries to do now. We're just at the beginning, but we are formulating different plans of action. And again, working with the city auditor through these community councils seems to be a very good idea to also try to pressure the local administration to change gears, right? So both kind of solidarity economies. Here in Tulsa, we have a group called the Really Free Market, for example, that is connected with us. They there's once a month, there's a complete trade that has no money involved, and people get a lot of goods and bring a lot of goods. Cooperation Tulsa has a land that now we're building also alternative housing on. But we are also trying to not just do solidarity economies, also to try to pressure the city somehow. But so just to conclude, the YouTube channel is where you can find all that we've done so far, Forum for Real Economic Emancipation. And if you want to connect, of course, you just email me and we can figure out how we can try to build this together. Okay, so let's start with your first question. So I mean, again, there's never one one unidimensional answer, monodimensional answer, right? When one does historical analysis. And again, I think what's very important to realize how not only economists are very political, historians are very political too. And it's not by chance that the period, by the way, in the first part of my book, I reconstruct all these post-capitalist experiments. I was basically the first one to write about it. It was incredible to me to find out like the amount of purposeful lack of knowledge, right? Historians all focused on basically the Great Depression. Guess why? Because workers had already lost all their like ideational power and all their economic power. And there's such little about 1919, 1920 that are years that are much more inspirational for the present moment, I think. So again, history is highly historians are organic intellectuals of the bourgeoisie, and they do it very well in a way, right? About the Economist, it was a mix of both. What I find that interesting in the research I've done is to actually show how frightened they were for the potential social transformation. And so how even if they pretended, they were talking about like deduction coming from pure syllogisms, deductions coming from pure syllogisms, they were actually incredibly all about crashing workers' power and showing how workers were worthless in terms of value production and economic rationality, right? So there's that element. And then, of course, there is the element about how they had to actively, politically eliminate the other traditions in economics. In Italy, the historical school was very strong. The German tradition was very strong. And they had to basically, purchase the journals, start publishing, censoring other stuff. They had to start actually, academia is all about battling who gets hired and who gets fired. And plus, they were also working for the cabinet of Mussolini, writing on newspapers. So they were very active at all these levels, and for with all the levers of power in a way. So that's the answer to that. About the falling rate of profit, I think a lot of Marxian analysis is too heavily deterministic. And I think this idea that there's we should focus on the falling rate of profit as the main one of the main reasons for crisis. I try to say, well, the real crisis of capitalism is not an economic crisis. It's a political crisis. Again, it's when the capital as a social relation breaks. And it's interesting to see that Marxian analysis has kind of taken from these neoclassical framework, this eagerness to find these laws that supposedly tell us how everything is gonna pan out, rather than focus on the class struggle, which is by definition indeterminate, and that the reason why you need political organization to move it in one direction or the other, which is something, by the way, that the neoclassical economists understood very, very well. So what I would tell you that austerity actually shows you how capitalism has no vision, right? Well, the climate shows it very well. There's no vision under capitalism. There's no plan. By definition, we know it's an anarchic and completely warlike system, also for those investors who the state tries to support. And so the fact is that austerity accelerates, I think, the contradictions, right? Austerity can actually accelerate the reasons why there can be more overproduction crisis, more lack of demand crisis, right? In purely economic terms, because purchasing power of the workers go down. And so austerity is, in this sense, accelerates the contradictions. But what I want to point out is that it's doing the most important job, which is that of maintaining capital as a social relation, stable and protected. So that comes first. Because if people start saying we want a different system, the whole system is screwed. So what comes first is maintaining the class balance in favor of the few, even at the cost of the recession. And this is important because the Federal Reserve knows that if interest rates go up, there's a risk for a recession, right? And they say it. And this is what happened also in Britain. There was a huge slowdown and meltdown of the economy. But this is a short-term loss for a much more structural win, which is that of disciplining worker power. And this is what capitalism is about. Again, it's a short-term, very aggressive vision that is about political oppression. And this is very, very important. So sorry, I'm going to try to accelerate. Now, the question about fascism. again, there's never one monodimensional answer. What I could tell you is that the originating founding father of fascism was the typical kind of Salvador Allende story. Okay, it was a much more similar to that story, in the sense that fascism was a way to crash the alternative. So, and it was the most effective capitalist governance in moments of heightened threat to the system, right? When people were organizing, were winning, then you needed, like, the liberals were like, okay, you know what? This is actually Montagu Norman, the head of the Bank of England. I have a letter from him I found in the archives. He says the Duce was the right man at a critical moment, so that this pendulum was not to swing too far in the other direction, right? So he says he's torturing, killing, beating, whatever. He's doing what we need economically, and that comes first. So again, showing the real face of the liberals when it comes to, like, protecting the capital order, I think, and that's important. Of course, the other types of fascism, Nazism, it was more of a similar story to what we can see today. Is the fact that austerity works so well to disempower people. It works so well in the 20s to, like, screw over working class organization in Germany, that Hitler seemed the right man for them in order to say, okay, the problems, of course, are the Jews, the problem are the immigrants, what we see today, right? So it disempowered working class, austerity disempowers effectively, and heightens the interest for strong men, and these men ultimately escalate further austerity, right? Hitler did austerity, a lot of austerity against the workers. Again, militarism is completely compatible with austerity. It falls in the same logic. Trump is doing a bunch of austerity. So, authoritarianism and austerity kind of feed into each other pretty well, I think. And that's a reality that we need to face. I have a little bit about this. A little book is coming out of mine with Simon Schuster actually in January, called Escape from Capitalism. And it's kind of a abbreviated version that tries to also kind of, like, pan out, like, the political messages of the previous book. And so that's coming out soon. Again, I'm happy to share in other forms if you don't feel like buying the book.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mattei. Next, we're just for a final comment, we're going to go to our comrade Jolene, and then we will sign off here
Thank
on
you so
Zoom.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for jumping out of your assembly to speak with us. I think what you've said is there's so much to what you've said, and we don't have time to go into it. But the challenge remains that, this is really what we know is coming from the ruling class, that they've imposed austerity time and time and time and time again, and told us over and over and over again that it's the working people that have to suffer, that we have to make our own ends meet, and that we have to make do. And now, I think with climate change especially, it's going to be even more heightened, right? It's going to be a question of blocking even more immigrants out, even more people that have been displaced and have nothing. Gaza and Sudan being just the glimpse of what's coming for most of the world, or much of the equatorial regions of the world. And so then when we really picture what's coming, and I think you do a really good job at pointing out where this comes from liberals, and it comes from fascists. It comes from all these different sections of the ruling class that really do want to normalize taking away our livelihoods. And the challenge for all of us that's in this meeting, and all of us who are in assemblies like that, and all of the people around this country and around the world that are dissatisfied with the idea and cannot picture, just having more and more taken away from us, is what do we do? How do we make the struggle in front of us political, meaning we go beyond trying to make ends meet, and we actually say, you know what, we demand that we actually take back from the billionaires and from the people with the wealth, from the grocery stores that are going to, more heavily police the aisles, etc., while we are cut off from SNAP. Like, how do we take back the resources that we created? as working people, the wealth that we created. And I think that one of, the lessons of the past that you come back to time and time again is the fact that that working people really did scare the shit out of the people in power in times in the past when we went on strike and when we formed, councils, when we actually had mass movements that made this system ungovernable for them. And I think how that relates to today is that has to be our goal. That has to be our North Star, so to speak. And it has to be with the goal of winning, because so long as the people in power remain in power, they're going to re-entrench, taking wealth from the wealth that we create into their military, into their ICE force, into their police force. And we have to put a stop to that. So I think the concrete things, Clara listed some things that we can do in different areas. Here we do many similar things. We can be involved in all of the organizing efforts that are available to us. And we can try to really play a role. One thing that we did here in North Carolina was in the No Kings protests, we helped make one of the No Kings protests actually No Kings, No Billionaires. How do we reintroduce the idea that this is a class struggle, that this is the working class, and all of the diverse sections of the working class against the tiny, tiny fraction, that 1%, that 0.1% that wants to take everything, including our planet and including our futures, away from us. So I think in many ways, it's a very desperate and very depressing time, but we also have the potential of really winning and really seeing that we really do have nothing to lose. And we really have everything to lose. We have our lives and our planet to lose, but that we have everything to gain as well, from a world that is actually made and decided for working people. So with that, I hope everyone has ways to be involved in organizing where they are. Obviously, speak out. Socialists is a way that you can get connected, get organized, start to answer your own political questions and the questions that you have of what are we facing. And in Tulsa and in many of the other places that people on Zoom and joining us today are in. So we hope that we all stay connected and continue to be organized after today. Thank you.
Can I just say one word? Can you hear me still? Thank you. That's great. Yes, this is the main message, is that capital is extremely fragile, because this is very important. It's like, I know we're depressed and I know everything is bleak, but if you look at history, okay, if you look at history, what you find out is actually that historically the elite is terrified, and that's why you need austerity to constantly actively intervene to protect the capital order. And without this this is why they're constantly acting, and we also need to constantly act. And the small things really matter. I think I forgot to answer the question about the how locally, what do you do? Well, for example, taxing the rich, you can do locally. You can raise income taxes, for example, if you have the political will, but you'll only have the political will if you're a local government, if you have pressure from below, from government, from citizens, from these assemblies. And so that's really important to build, I think. Yes, so to close, I would love, if it's possible, for a follow-up with the names of the various organizations that were on this call, so that potentially we can connect with what we're doing and we can learn from each other. And again, I think also using narratives that speak to people outside of the usual select few that have already been politicized is very, very important. That's why I think, for example, food sovereignty, incarceration, or tax the rich, these things are things that can really involve people that are not necessarily already willing to kind of participate for change. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you guys have a great assembly, and you know where to find me.